There's a moment in every great story where the tides begin to turn, where light, no matter how faint, finally pushes back against the dark. Tonight, we step into one of those moments, a chapter woven with threads of despair and hope, where the fate of an entire world trembled on the edge of a single decision. Picture this: the Valar, those mighty beings of ancient power, gathered in the Ring of Doom, their voices a low hum of sorrow and resolve. The air is thick with the weight of ages, and in the silence between their words, you can almost hear the distant cries of the elves, their pleas carried on the wind from a Middle-earth drowning in shadow. Wherever you're listening from, whether it's the quiet of midnight or the hush of dawn, we'd love to know what time your own journey into this tale begins. Let us know in the comments below, because stories like this are best shared, voice to voice, across the miles. This is the War of Wrath, the defining conflict of an age, where the Valar at last stirred from their long watch to face Morgoth, the dark enemy of the world. For centuries, his cruelty had festered, his shadow stretching further with each passing year, until even the stars themselves seemed to dim under his malice. The elves, those radiant children of the dawn, had fought valiantly, but their strength was waning. Their cities lay in ruins, their songs choked by smoke and sorrow. And so, in the Ring of Doom, Eönwë, the noblest of the Valar, raised his hand not in anger, but in solemn resolve. The time had come. No longer could they stand aside. The fate of Beleriand, that once glorious land, now hung by the thinnest thread. What follows is a tale of fire and ruin, of courage that borders on madness, and of sacrifices that echo across eternity. It's a story where the very earth trembles beneath the march of armies, where the seas rise in fury, and where light, though battered, refuses to be extinguished. So settle in, close your eyes, and let your imagination carry you to those far-off shores. Whether you're here to drift into sleep, or simply to lose yourself in legend, remember this: even in the darkest hour, there are those who will stand against the night. And tonight, their story is yours to witness. The golden city of Valinor had never known such a sound. The clear, piercing call of Eönwë's trumpet echoed through its radiant streets, a note so pure it stirred even the stones beneath their feet. The herald of Eönwë stood tall, his presence like a living banner, and as the last echoes faded, the response was immediate. Maiar, those lesser spirits of divine flame, gathered in ranks, their forms shifting between light and shadow, ready to take shape for battle. Beside them, the Fëanor, fairest of elves, strapped on armor that caught the fading glow of Laurelin and Tulperion, as if the very trees wished them strength one final time. But not all hearts were so resolute. Among the host stood elves who had once turned away from the light of Valinor, their faces etched with old regrets. They had chosen Middle-earth, its wild skies and unshaped lands, over the undying bliss of the West. Now, as the shadow of Morgoth stretched ever further, even their pride wavered. Some clutched swords with white-knuckled grips, their thoughts racing. Was this redemption, or merely another choice they would come to rue? The call to arms was clear, yet their feet moved as though weighed by invisible chains. Down to the shores they marched, past the white towers of Tirion, where banners fluttered like captured starlight. The sea, usually a mirror of calm, now churned with restless waves, as if Ulmo himself stirred the waters in anticipation. A wind rose, carrying salt and something fiercer, the promise of storms yet to come. Ships waited, their prows carved in the likeness of eagles and swans, ready to bear the host across the sundering seas. And as the first warriors stepped aboard, the very air seemed to hum with a single, unspoken truth. This war would scar the world. Lands would drown, mountains would crumble, and songs would be lost to time. But for now, there was only the sound of armor clinking, the murmur of prayers, and the slow, steady drumbeat of destiny drawing near. The Teleri sailors moved with a quiet grace, their hands steady on the ropes despite the storm brewing in their hearts. These were the same ships, gleaming hulls of pearl and silver, that had once sparked kinslaying between elf and elf, a wound still tender beneath the weight of centuries. Yet here they stood, their voices lifted not in joyous sea shanties, but in low, mournful hymns that wove through the crashing waves like threads of memory. The ocean itself seemed to recoil at their passage, great swells rising like walls of liquid night, as if Ulmo wished to test their resolve before allowing them near the cursed shores of Middle-earth. And then, there he was, Eärendil, the mariner, his figure ablaze with the light of the Silmaril bound upon his brow. It cut through the tempest like a knife through cloth, casting long beams across the churning waters, guiding the fleet through the chaos, as though the very waves parted in reverence. To the weary elves watching from the decks, he seemed less a man and more a vision, a fragment of starlight given flesh. Some whispered that this was the work of the Valar, a final mercy in a world grown cruel. Others simply wept, for in his radiance they glimpsed something they thought lost forever, hope. Ahead, the horizon swallowed itself in smoke. The shores of Beleriand, once fair and green, now smoldered under Morgoth's touch, the skyline choked with pillars of black vapor. Flashes of distant fire pulsed like a sickly heartbeat, and the wind carried the metallic tang of blood and ash. The Teleri tightened their grips on the rails, their songs faltering. This was not the land they remembered. The waves here did not sing. They screamed, yet the ships pressed on, drawn forward by Eärendil's light, as if the sea itself had grown weary of darkness and longed, at last, for dawn. High above, the clouds twisted into shapes too sharp to be natural. Winged shadows darted between them, their shrieks slicing through the thunder. The dragons of Morgoth had taken to the skies, their scales glinting like oil on water. But the host did not cower. Armor clanked as warriors stood taller, blades unsheathed in unison. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring, then snapped. A single arrow, then 100, then 1,000, arced upward, their tips catching Eärendil's light as they flew. The battle for Middle-earth had begun not with a roar, but with the whisper of feathers and steel cutting the wind. And through it all, the Silmaril burned brighter. The first vessels struck the blackened shore with a sound like cracking bones, their hulls scraping against what remained of the beaches of Sirion. Where once there had been silver sands and murmuring reeds, now there was only a wasteland of ash and jagged stone, the river's mouth choked with the wreckage of dead trees. The host of Valinor disembarked in eerie silence, their boots sinking into the scorched earth, as though the land itself recoiled from their touch. Then, a tremor. Not from the earth, but from the fortress of Angband far to the north, where Morgoth's spies had surely seen the glow of Eärendil's Silmaril piercing the perpetual gloom. The Dark Lord's armies would already be stirring, their ragged ranks scrambling to meet this unforeseen threat. From the broken hills and hollowed-out ruins, gaunt faces peered. Elves who had survived the fall of Gondolin, their once radiant cloaks now tattered, clutched crude spears carved from splintered wood. Children of Doriath, raised on tales of the Valor's splendor, pressed shaking hands to their mouths at the sight of Eärendil's banner unfurling, a standard woven from light itself, its sigil burning brighter than any flame. For these refugees, years of hiding, of scavenging and whispering in the dark, had worn hope thin as old parchment. Now, as the herald's voice rang out across the desolation, some wept openly. Others simply stared, too hollowed by grief to trust what they saw. The first skirmishes erupted like brush fires. Orcs, caught unprepared, scrambled from their trenches in disarray, their crude armor clattering as they tripped over scorched roots. Balrogs, few but terrible, uncoiled from the shadows, their whips of fire splitting the air with cracks like thunder. Yet for every horror Morgoth sent rushing south, the host of Valinor stood unbroken. The Vanyar advanced in perfect formation, their spears a bristling wall of silver, while the Maiar, shifting between forms of storm and sword, cut through the enemy lines like wind through dry grass. And then came the land's answer. The earth groaned, fissures splitting open to swallow both friend and foe alike. Rivers twisted in their beds, flowing backward as if time itself had stumbled. Birds, long absent from this blighted place, wheeled overhead in shrieking flocks, their wings blotting out the sickly sun. It was as though Beleriand, in its agony, could no longer tell Savior from Scourge, only that the end, for good or ill, was coming. High on a ridge, a lone figure watched. Chuar, now aged beyond his mortal years but still unbent, gripped the hilt of his sword. Beside him, Idril's hair streamed like pale smoke in the wind. They had lost everything, their home, their king, their son to the heavens. And yet, as the host marched north, something like peace flickered across their faces. The reckoning would be terrible, the price would be unbearable, but at last, after centuries of darkness, the scales were tipping. The air above Angband hung thick with smoke and the sulphurous stench of Morgoth's forges, a smothering blanket that even the Valor's banners could not pierce. The fortress itself loomed like a jagged wound in the earth, its towers clawing at the sky as if to drag the very heavens down into darkness. Day after day, the host of Valinor tightened their siege, their encampments forming a ring of flickering campfires that mirrored the distant stars, each one a defiance against the eternal night Morgoth had sought to impose. From the high passes of the Eärendil, the growls of dragons rolled like thunder, their scales glinting dully in the firelight as they prowled the ramparts. Below, in the tunnels that wormed through the mountains like veins of rot, Balrogs stirred, their fiery whips coiling and uncoiling in restless anticipation. The earth trembled not just from their movements, but from something deeper, something ancient and angry, as though the roots of the world itself recoiled at what was to come. Yet amid the grim resolve of the Valor's host, a murmur of disquiet spread. The elves of Beleriand, though heartened by the arrival of their kin from across the sea, could not shake the shadow of old oaths. The name of Fëanor passed in whispers, his cursed vow echoing across the centuries like a ghost none could exorcise. Some clutched their swords tighter, their eyes darting toward the Silmaril blazing upon Eärendil's brow. Was it hope they carried, or the seeds of another betrayal? Then came the drums, not the steady march of the Valar's advance, but a slow, ominous rhythm that seemed to rise from the very stone beneath their feet. The gates of Angband shuddered, iron groaning against iron, and a hush fell over the siege lines. For a breath, the world held still. Then, with a roar that split the sky, the doors burst open, and Morgoth's legions poured forth like a black tide, their screams drowning out even the crash of the surf upon the ruined shores. The first clash was a storm of steel and flame. The Vanir met the onslaught with shields locked, their spears gleaming like a forest of silver in the firelight. The Maiar, their forms shifting between mist and lightning, wove through the fray, striking where the enemy ranks frayed. But Morgoth had saved his foulest creations for this hour. Winged dragons, their bellies full of molten death, swooped low, their shadows swallowing whole companies of elves in an instant. The earth cracked open, vomiting forth fire and twisted creatures whose very shapes seemed to writhe in torment. High above the carnage, Eönwë raised his horn, its note piercing the din like a blade of light. The call was answered not by the host alone, but by the winds, the waves, the very stones of Beleriand, as though the land itself had chosen this moment to rise against its tormentor. The siege had begun in earnest, but the war would reshape the world, and in the heart of it all, the Silmaril burned brighter still, a beacon not just for the desperate, but for the damned. The night was thick with the scent of charred earth and spent arrows when Medros and Maglar made their choice. Their oath, the same cursed vow that had spilled rivers of elven blood centuries before, twisted in their hearts like a blade left too long in a wound. Around them, the campfires of the Host of Valinor flickered, casting long shadows where warriors slept exhausted from the day's battle. Eönwë's pavilion stood at the center, its banners limp in the windless dark, and within it, the Silmaril pulsed like a trapped star. They moved as wraiths, their footsteps soundless on the scorched grass. No words passed between them, none were needed. The oath demanded what it had always demanded, possession, no matter the cost. Their swords, forged in a brighter age, when their father's brilliance had not yet curdled into madness, gleamed dully in the gloom. The centuries elves of Valinor, their faces unlined by centuries of war, never saw the brothers coming. Steel flashed, and the first cries tore through the stillness. What followed was not battle, but butchery. Elves who had marched across the sea to save their kin now fell to blades they'd trusted as allies. The ground, already soaked with the blood of Morgoth's creatures, drank anew. Maglar's hand trembled as he parried a desperate strike from a Vanir warrior, the man's eyes wide with betrayal. "Why?" gasped the elf, but Maglar had no answer that would not choke him. Medros, his face a mask of grim purpose, fought with the cold efficiency of one who had long since numbed himself to remorse. Then came the light, not the Silmaril's radiance, but a searing golden glow that split the night as Eärendil himself descended, his wrath igniting the air like summer lightning. Traitors, his voice was not a shout, but a force that shook the earth. The brothers staggered, their swords slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers. Around them, the surviving elves recoiled, their wounds forgotten in the face of divine fury. The herald's gaze bore into them, and in that moment, Medros understood. Their doom had always been waiting here, at the end of this path. The Host of Valinor drew back, forming a hollow circle around the brothers and the herald. No one raised a weapon, none needed to. The weight of their crime pressed down like the hand of a god, and the Silmaril, still clutched in Eönwë's grasp, burned as if in mockery of their suffering. In the end, it was Maglar who broke first. His knees struck the earth, and a sound escaped him, half sob, half song, the last frayed thread of a poet's soul unraveling. Medros stood rigid, his defiance a brittle thing, until Eärendil spoke again, softer now, but no less final. Go, the Valor will not slay you, for your house has slain enough. The brothers stumbled into the darkness, their names already becoming curses whispered around campfires. Behind them, the war raged on, but the heart of it had changed. Alliances forged in desperation, now soured with suspicion. Elves who had fought side by side for years eyed each other's hands, wondering whose blade might turn next. And Morgoth, watching from his fortress of shadows, laughed, a sound like bones grinding beneath the weight of the world. The sky tore open with a sound like the world itself screaming. From the depths of Angband's smoking pits rose Ancalagon the Black, Morgoth's most terrible creation, a dragon so vast his wings could eclipse the sun, his scales drinking in the light until even the stars seemed to dim in terror. The earth trembled as he took flight, his shadow unfurling across the battlefield like a living shroud, his breath a storm of fire that turned the very air to ash. Below, elves and Maiar staggered back, their swords useless against this monstrosity of scale and flame. For the first time, since the Host of Valinor had landed on these ruined shores, despair flickered in their eyes. Then, a pinprick of light in the roiling darkness. High above, where the smoke thinned and the sky still remembered blue, Vingalot cut through the clouds like a blade through silk. Eärendil stood at the prow, the Silmaril bound to his brow, blazing with a radiance that made Ancalagon snarl and twist in midair. This was no mortal light. It was the purity of the undying lands distilled into a single, piercing gleam. The great dragon wheeled, his tail lashing mountains into rubble, and the heavens themselves became their battleground. Eagles of Eönwë, their wingspan like drifting clouds, dove from the sunlit heights to harry Ancalagon, their talons scraping against scales harder than iron. Fire met feather, claw met steel, and the sky burned with streaks of gold and black. Vingalot danced between the collisions, Eärendil's hand steady on the tiller as he guided his ship through the chaos. Below, the armies of elves and Valor stood frozen, their battle forgotten as they craned their necks to watch the duel that would decide the fate of all things. Ancalagon coiled like a serpent ready to strike, his maw gaping wide enough to swallow Vingalot whole, but Eärendil was faster. The Silmaril flared, its light condensing into a single beam that lanced through the dragon's eye, deep into the twisted darkness of his mind. Ancalagon shrieked, a sound that shattered stone and sent rivers leaping from their beds. His wings flailed, his body twisting in agony as the light scoured him from within. Then, with a final shuddering convulsion, he fell. The impact shook the foundations of the world. Thangarodrim, Morgoth's towering fortress of fire and iron, crumpled like sand beneath a wave, its peaks shearing away as Ancalagon's corpse smashed through them. The earth split, vomiting forth geysers of molten rock that painted the sky in lurid reds and oranges. Mountains slid into the sea, valleys rose into new hills, and the very shape of Beleriand groaned under the weight of its own ruin. Silence followed, not the quiet of peace, but the hush of a breath held too long. Then, from the ruins of Thangarodrim, a new light spilled, not the sickly glow of Morgoth's forges, but the first true dawn in an age. Eärendil's Silmaril, untainted by the dragon's fall, still burned, and as the sun climbed over the wreckage, the host of Valinor raised their voices in a song that had not been heard in Middle-earth since the days of the trees. The shadow of Ancalagon was gone, but the war was not yet done. The ground heaved like a living thing, great chunks of rock twisting skyward before crashing back into the abyss below. Thangarodrim, those towering peaks forged from Morgoth's malice, groaned as their foundations gave way, their slopes collapsing inward like a sandcastle before the tide. Rivers of fire vomited from fissures in the earth, molten veins carving new paths through what remained of Beleriand, hissing where they met the sea in great clouds of steam. The air itself shimmered with heat, distorting the figures of the advancing host of Valinor as they picked their way through the devastation, their armor reflecting the hellish glow like shards of fallen stars. From the depths of the crumbling fortress rose a sound, not the roar of dragons or the cacophony of battle, but a howl of raw, unhinged fury. Morgoth, once a being of unimaginable power, now scrabbled backward through the ruins of his own dominion, his form diminished, his crown of iron bent askew. The fires that had once wreathed him like a second skin sputtered weakly, their light guttering as his stolen strength bled away into the broken earth. Yet even in retreat, his malice coiled like a serpent. With a final, desperate gesture, he wrenched open a fissure beneath his own feet, plunging into the darkness rather than face judgment beneath the Valar's gaze. The host hesitated at the edge of the chasm, their weapons lowered but their eyes alight with wary triumph. This was not the clean victory of songs. The land around them was a corpse, its bones exposed to the sky, its rivers running black with ash. Cities that had stood for ages were now little more than smudges on the horizon, their proud towers reduced to toothless stumps. Even the air tasted of endings, thick with the grit of pulverized stone and the metallic tang of spilled blood. And yet, amid the ruin, life flickered. A sapling, its leaves still curled tight like a child's fist, pushed through the cracked soil near a fallen elven shield. A bird, its feathers streaked with soot, alighted on a twisted spear shaft and trilled a note so pure it seemed to silence the world for a heartbeat. The host of Valinor turned their faces to the east, where the first true sunrise in centuries painted the smoke in gold and rose. The war was over, but the healing, for those who remained, would be the work of lifetimes. Far above, unnoticed by the exhausted armies, a single star burned brighter than the rest. Eärendil's ship sailed the heavens, its light a silent promise. No shadow, no matter how deep, could endure forever. The ruins of Angband shuddered as Tulkas the Valiant took his first step inside, his laughter rolling like thunder through the shattered halls. No weapon graced his hands, only his fists, clenched and eager, for the mightiest of the Valar needed no blade to humble the fallen foe. Morgoth, crouched among the wreckage of his own throne like a cornered beast, snarled defiance, but the fire in his eyes had dwindled to embers. His once great form, which had darkened the skies and twisted the earth, now seemed shrunken, his armor cracked, his stolen jewels long since wrested from him. Tulkas did not hesitate. With a grip that could snap mountains, he seized the Dark Lord, the chains forged by all, his own hands glowing white-hot as they coiled around him. their links singing with the power of unbreakable oaths. A hush fell over the Host of Valinor as Morgoth was dragged into the light. The sky, still choked with smoke from the fallen Thangarodrim, parted briefly, as if unwilling to shield him any longer. Elves who had spent centuries whispering his name in dread now stared openly, their faces a tapestry of disgust and weary triumph. Even the Maiar, those spirits of flame and song, stood silent, their luminous forms flickering with something akin to pity. For the first time since the world's shaping, Morgoth Boglier was nothing more than a prisoner, his curses dissolving into whimpers as the Valor gathered in judgment. Manwë's voice, when it came, carried neither rage nor gloating, but a sorrow as deep as the sea. Melkor, he spoke the name Morgoth had once borne, the sound of it like a bell tolling for a lost age. Your shadow ends here. The pronouncement hung in the air, heavier than any chain. There would be no grand battle now, no last stand, only the slow, shameful unraveling of a tyrant's pride. The Valor turned as one, their gazes stripping away the remnants of Morgoth's stolen majesty, until only a hollow shell remained, his darkness leaching into the earth like spilled ink. Yet amid the reckoning, a quieter tension thrummed. Upon a cloth of silver lay the Silmarils, their light undimmed by the blood spilled in their name. But something was amiss. Where once their radiance had been pure, now a sullen flicker pulsed within, as though the gems themselves remembered the hands that had clung to them in greed and desperation. Eönwë reached to lift one, then stilled, his brow furrowing. The host murmured, uneasy. The oath of Fëanor had left its mark, not on the world, but on the very things his sons had sworn to reclaim. And so the war ended not with a clash, but with a question, whispered from lip to lip, as the winds scoured the broken land. What fate awaited treasures that carried both the light of the trees and the weight of a curse? The Valor turned their faces westward, toward the sea, but the answer lay elsewhere in the hands of those who had long since passed beyond the reach of even the mightiest of the gods. The wind carried the scent of burnt flesh and salt as Medros stood at the edge of the fissure, the Silmaril clenched in his ruined hand. Its light, once a thing of beauty, now seared his skin like molten iron, the pain a mirror of the oath that had gnawed at his spirit for centuries. Beside him, Maglor swayed, his voice, once the pride of elvenkind, reduced to a hoarse whisper, his fingers blackened where the jewel's fire had licked them. The Host of Valinor had turned away, their pity worse than any blade. There would be no forgiveness, no songs sung of their deeds, only this, the chasm yawning before them, its depths alive with the last flickers of Morgoth's forges. Medros did not hesitate. His laughter, bitter as poisoned wine, rang out once before he stepped into emptiness, the Silmaril's glow swallowed by the abyss. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the earth shuddered, the fire below flaring as if in mockery of the light it had consumed. Maglor's knees struck the rocky shore, his brother's name, a ragged cry, lost in the crash of waves. The second Silmaril rolled from his grip, its radiance dimming as it touched the frothing tide. The sea, ever hungry, coiled around it, and then it too was gone. Far to the west, Eönwë cradled the last jewel, its light unmarred by blood or betrayal. Yet even here, in hands uncursed, the Silmaril seemed to pulse with a sorrow of its own. The wind, scouring the ruins of Beleriand, carried fragments of Maglor's final lament. a melody woven from grief and the broken threads of a once great house. The oath was fulfilled, the price had been paid, and as the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the smallness of mortal sorrows, the waves whispered secrets no elf would ever hear. The fires had cooled, the wars had ended, but the silence left in their wake was louder than any battle cry. Along the shores of what had once been Beleriand, the Noldor gathered, their voices weaving a lament older than the mountains now drowned beneath the waves. The wind carried their grief, snatching at the edges of cloaks, frayed by centuries of conflict, tugging like the restless spirits of those who would never sail west. Among them stood Elrond, his young face too solemn for his years, his fingers brushing the hilt of a dagger he'd never drawn in anger. War had shaped him before he'd learned to speak his own name, raised in the shadow of falling kingdoms, weaned on tales of glory that now rang hollow as the ruins around them. Near the water's edge, Galadriel stood motionless, her golden hair dulled by ash and salt. The pride that had once burned in her like an unquenchable flame had been tempered, folded into something quieter, heavier. The sea before her was no longer just water. It was a mirror reflecting choices made and roads untaken. Valinor's call sang in her blood, a melody she'd spent ages denying. Yet now the weight of Middle-earth scars pressed against her ribs like a second skin. To leave would be to abandon the land she'd fought for. To stay would be to live forever in the wreckage of dreams that had curdled long before the first dragon took flight. Behind them, the remnants of Gondolin's banners fluttered in the wind, their once bright colors faded to ghosts. The Noldor's greatest cities, Gondolin, Nargothrond, Doriath, were now little more than names whispered over campfires, their splendor swallowed by the same waters that had carried Morgoth's doom. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing to the horizon where the last peaks of Thangorodrim had vanished beneath the waves. Will it all be gone tomorrow? She asked, her voice small against the vastness of the sea. Her mother had no answer, and so they grieved, not just for the dead, but for the living. For the songs that would never be sung again, for the stories that had ended mid-verse. The War of Wrath had broken more than armies. It had shattered the very idea of victory. What good was a world saved when the cost had been the world they'd known? Elrond's gaze drifted to Maglar's distant figure, the last son of Fëanor, his once mighty voice now a rasping shadow of itself. Some oaths left scars no healer could mend. As the sun dipped below the water, staining the sky in hues of blood and gold, the Noldor's lament rose anew, a song without resolution, a chord that would not settle. The sea did not answer. It only sighed as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries more, carrying neither judgment nor mercy, only memory. The door of night yawned open, a maw of nothingness, darker than the voids between stars. There, at the threshold where time frayed like torn cloth, the Valar stood in solemn array, their faces unreadable, their radiance dimmed by the weight of what they must do. Tulkas, ever the fiercest, dragged Morgoth forward, the Dark Lord's once mighty form, now hunched and withered, his chains clinking like a beggar's coins. No words passed between captor and captive. None were needed. The air itself seemed to thicken as Man, or raised his hand, not in wrath, but in weary finality. With a sound like a sigh, woven through with thunder, Morgoth was cast into the abyss, his howl of rage unraveling into silence before it could reach the edges of the world. The door shuddered shut, its seal ringing with the finality of a tomb slab. For a moment, the heavens held their breath. Then, a tremor, subtle as a heartbeat, passed through the fabric of creation. The last residue of Morgoth's corruption, those clinging tendrils of shadow that had twisted the roots of mountains and the dreams of men, withered like frost beneath the dawn. The stars, long veiled by his malice, burned suddenly brighter, their light falling upon a Middle Earth that bore the scars of his passing, but no longer his presence. Yet Manwë did not rejoice. His eyes, older than the continents, turned eastward, where the first cities of men were rising from the ashes. Evil had been banished, not vanquished. The shadow of Morgoth was gone, but his whispers lingered in the hearts of those who had never known his face, his poison seeping into the soil like a slow working blight. And so the Valar withdrew, their task complete but their vigilance unending. The ages to come would not be marked by war or wrath, but by something subtler, a quiet reckoning, a gathering of strength. The elves, those few who remained, would carry the memory of the war of wrath like a scar, their songs bittersweet with triumph and loss. Men, young and unburdened by the weight of ancient oaths, would forge kingdoms under skies untouched by dragons. But in the deep places of the world, in the unlit corners where even the Valar's gaze seldom fell, something stirred. Not Morgoth, never again Morgoth, but the echo of his laugh, the shape of his cunning, waiting for new hands to grasp it. The door of night was shut, the world was changed, and somewhere, beyond the reach of even the wisest, a shadow sighed not in defeat, but in patience. The waters came not in waves, but in great, heaving sighs, as if the sea itself had wearied of restraint. What remained of Beleriand and shuddered beneath the weight of its own ruin, the land groaning like a wounded beast as the tides clawed at its edges. Cliffs that had stood since the world's youth crumbled into the abyss, their collapse sending up plumes of salt and stone that hung in the air like ghosts. Rivers, their courses twisted beyond recognition, reversed direction in frantic swirls, carrying with them shattered weapons, splintered shields, and the occasional glint of a forgotten Silmaril, its light drowned at last. On the shores, the survivors gathered like storm-tossed leaves. Elves who had once walked the glittering halls of Minigroth now clutched makeshift bundles, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Mortal men, their lifespans too brief to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe, shepherded children who would grow up knowing Beleriand, and only as a name in lullabies. The ships, few and frayed at the edges, bobbed restlessly in the rising surf, their hulls packed with refugees who spoke little, as though words might make the land's demise more real. A woman reached into the water, her fingers brushing a floating branch, still clinging to a single golden leaf. It dissolved at her touch, as if the past itself refused to be held. Above, the stars burned with a clarity unseen in ages. Eärendil's ship, now a fixed point in the heavens, cast its glow upon the fleeing host, a silent guide for those who dared to hope. Yet even in their brilliance, the constellations seemed altered. Their patterns shifted, as though the sky too had been scarred by war. Elrond, standing at the prow of a weathered vessel, traced their new shapes with a healer's hand, his mind already weaving their stories into verse. The old tales would end here, in the deep. The new ones, they would be written on foreign soil, in languages not yet spoken. Behind them, the sea's dirge rose to a crescendo. Cities that had defied Morgoth for centuries slipped beneath the surface without fanfare. Gondolin's white towers, Doriath's hidden groves, Nargothrond's echoing caverns, all swallowed by the hunger of the waves. The water did not discriminate. It took friend and foe alike, the graves of heroes and tyrants, merging into one vast, unmarked grave, and then a sound, faint but unmistakable. From the furthest ship, a child's laugh rang out, sharp and bright as a bell. Heads turned, some frowned as though joy were a betrayal. Others, despite themselves, smiled. The sun, rising over the eastern horizon, painted the sails in hues of apricot and gold. The sea would keep its secrets, but the shore ahead, it waited, empty and green, its soil untouched by shadow. The wind shifted, carrying not the stench of ash, but the scent of earth after rain. Beleriand was gone, but the world, as it always did, had left room for morning. The host of Valinor gathered one final time upon the ravaged shores, their armor still gleaming, though the war had long since cooled in their bones. Eönwë's banner, once a blazing standard in the thick of battle, now hung limp in the salt-laced breeze, its golden threads dulled by smoke and time. The Valar stood tallest among them, their faces unmarked by the centuries of strife that had etched lines into the brows of the Elves of Beleriand. They had come as saviors, their spears like shafts of sunlight, cutting through the gloom, but now their eyes turned westward, toward the undying shores they had left behind. The Maiar lingered a pace apart, their forms flickering between mist and flame, as if already untethering from the weight of Middle-earth soil. Eönwë's voice, when he spoke, carried neither triumph nor pity, only the quiet certainty of a promise kept. "The way is open," he declared, his words weaving through the crowd like a ripple through still water. "To any who would cross the sea, the Valar offer pardon. The past is forgiven." A murmur rose, a tangled chorus of relief and reluctance. Some elves stepped forward at once, their hands trembling as they reached toward the ships, waiting at the water's edge. These were the ones who had watched their homes crumble too many times, their hearts too bruised to endure another age beneath mortal skies. Their wounds ran deeper than swords could carve. But others did not move, their fingers curled into fists at their sides, their gazes fixed not on the horizon, but on the scarred land behind them, the empty valleys where their children had played, the rivers that now ran black with memories. To these, Valinor was a dream half forgotten, a lullaby sung by voices long dust. Middle-earth, though broken, was theirs by choice as much as by loss. Among them, Galadriel stood silent, her chin lifted, her hair catching the wind like a banner of its own. Her refusal was not defiance, but a quiet reckoning. Some oaths could not be unmade by even the gentlest summons. Eönwë watched them all, his golden eyes missing nothing. He did not plead. The choice had always been theirs. With a final nod, he turned, and the host began its withdrawal. First the Maiar, their forms dissolving into light, then the Valar, their ranks falling into step as they waded into the surf. The elves who remained on the shore watched as the ships grew small against the sunset, their sails drinking the last of the daylight, and so the sundering deepened, not with a clash, but with the slow, inevitable parting of tides. Those who sailed would carry tales of Beleriand into the halls of the gods, their voices weaving the war of wrath into legend. Those who stayed would whisper it to the trees, the stones, the new generations who would never know the weight of a Silmaril. The sea stretched between them, vast and whispering, but the distance was more than water could measure. It was the space between memory and hope, between what was and what might yet be. Somewhere behind them, a nightingale sang a sound as out of place as laughter in a tomb. The elves who remained turned their faces toward it, their eyes bright with something that was not quite sorrow, not quite joy. The land was wounded, but it lived, and so, for now, would they. The first light of the Second Age dawned not with fanfare, but with the slow, patient work of hands rebuilding what fire and flood had stolen. Lindon, that green strip of land, cradled between the mountains and the sea, became a refuge for the scattered remnants of the Noldor, those who had chosen to remain in Middle-earth rather than sail into the west. Here, beneath banners stitched with stars, Gil Galad took up the mantle of High King, his rule a quiet testament to endurance. His halls by the Gulf of Lune were not the towering citadels of old, but low buildings of pale stone, their arches open to the salt wind. The elves who gathered there bore no crowns, only the dust of their journey and the stubborn light of memory in their eyes. Yet when Gil Galad spoke, his voice carried the weight of a lineage that stretched back to Tirion beneath the trees, and for the first time in an age, his people dared to believe in tomorrow. To the east, beyond the ruins of Eärendil, the dwarves returned to Khazad-dûm with a reverence that bordered on mourning. The great doors of mithril and stone still stood, though the hands that had carved them were long dust. The echoes of their hammers rang differently now, not in defiance, but in homage to the fathers of their fathers. The forges roared back to life, their glow painting the caverns in shades of copper and gold. Yet the songs sung in those depths were slower, deeper, as if each note carried the weight of lessons learned in fire and shadow. The dwarves had ever been a people apart, but now their isolation felt deliberate, a choice made not in pride, but in quiet reckoning with the price of trust. Meanwhile, in the lands where Morgoth's tread had once blackened the soil, men tilled fields where no crop had grown for centuries. Young kingdoms rose along the banks of the Anduin, and in the vales of the White Mountains, their names still soft on the tongues of those who spoke them Arnor, Gondor, Rivanion. These were not the grand cities of legend, but clusters of wooden halls and palisades, their hearths bright with laughter, untempered by the dread of dragons. The children born here knew nothing of the War of Wrath, their bedtime stories filled instead with tales of harvests and hearth kings. Yet in the councils of their elders, a question lingered like smoke beneath the rafters. Were they truly free, or had the shadow only learned to wear new shapes? For whispers slithered from the east, carried on caravans that traveled too lightly, in rumors of a land where the stars seemed dimmer and the nights colder. Travelers spoke of a city where the towers leaned as if bowed by an invisible weight, and of a people who bowed to no king, but to a lord they called only the giver of gifts. The elves who heard these tales exchanged glances heavy with unspoken doubt, for they had heard such honeyed titles before. Gil Galad, in his halls by the sea, kept his sword close, though he wore it less often now. The world had been remade once. It would not be remade so easily again, and so the age unfolded, not in the clash of armies, but in the turning of soil, the laying of foundations, the mending of threads long torn. The sea still murmured of lost Beleriand. The wind still carried the scent of ruins beneath the waves, but in the markets of Lindon and the forges of Khazad-dûm, life fragile, tenacious pushed onward. The shadow in the east would wait. The world, for now, was too busy with the work of dawn. The songs of the War of Wrath linger in the twilight, carried on the breath of minstrels and the rustle of ancient scrolls. They speak not just of battles won, but of choices etched in blood and fire, of oaths that bent the fate of nations. The Silmarils, those three jewels born from the light of the trees, lie now beyond mortal reach, one swallowed by the earth's molten heart, another drowned in the sea's unforgiving depths, the last bound forever to the heavens as the star of Eärendil. Yet their absence feels like a presence, a quiet hum beneath the world's skin. Every child who points to that glimmer in the night sky unknowingly touches the hem of an older story, one where light was both gift and curse, where longing could unmake kingdoms. The Valar, those mighty architects of the world, withdrew behind the veils of the West, their hands no longer shaping the tides of Middle-earth, but their fingerprints remain not in grand interventions, but in subtler things. Dawn breaks a little gentler now, as if Varda herself smooths the edges of the night. Storms still rage, yet they pass quicker, leaving behind air washed clean. Even the elves, those eternal exiles, sense it, a quietude in the wind, a patience in the soil. The age when gods walked openly among the children of Iluvatar has ended, but their absence is not abandonment. It is a space for new tales to grow, and grow they did, though not as any could have foreseen. The Second Age dawned with scars still tender, the land itself reshaped by war's fury. Beleriand, that cradle of so many legends, now sleeps beneath the waves, its ruins home only to fish and shifting sands. Yet from its sinking, new shores rose Linden's green hills, Eregion's hidden valleys, places where the Noldor planted saplings, where once their towers had stood. The dwarves, too, carved new halls into unbroken stone, their chisels echoing the old rhythms, but with a slower, wiser cadence. Even men, those brief-lived inheritors of a broken world, began to weave their own stories into the tapestry, their kingdoms rising like seedlings through cracked earth. But memory is a restless thing. In the quiet hours, when the fire burns low, the Elder still speak of the war in voices that fray at the edges. They do not sing of triumph alone, but of Fëanor's doomed house, of the sea's indifference to sorrow, of the cost measured not in slain dragons, but in splintered trust. Some lessons, it seems, must be learned again and again. The Valar watch, but they do not intervene. Perhaps they know what the elves are only beginning to grasp, that healing is not the work of a single age, and that some wounds are not meant to close cleanly. The star of Eärendil burns on, indifferent to the tears and laughter of those below. It is a beacon, yes, but also a mirror, showing each generation what they need to see. To a weary traveler, it might be hope. To a grieving widow, a reminder of love lost. To a child in Gondor's fledgling streets, simply a light to wish upon. The War of Wrath is over, but its echoes shape every step forward, every choice yet unmade. The age of myth may fade, but its shadows stretch long, painting the present in hues of gold and sorrow. And so the world turns, carrying the weight of all that was, and all that might still be. The firelight paints their faces in gold and shadow, as the old elf's voice trembles like a leaf in the wind. His fingers trace the air, as though weaving the tale anew, not just for the children nestled at his feet, but for the ghosts who lean in unseen, their names half remembered in the verses he sings. The War of Wrath unfolds not as a scroll of victories, but as a tapestry of sighs, the thunder of wings over Angband, the silence before Ancalagon's fall. the way the very ground wept as Beleriand sank beneath the waves. The children know these stories by heart, yet tonight, something shifts. Perhaps it's the way the wind carries the scent of salt from the distant sea, or how the stars seem to pulse in time with the old elf's pauses, but for the first time, the legend feels less like history and more like a whispered secret, passed palm to palm beneath the cover of darkness. One of the younger elves, a girl with her mother's sharp eyes, tugs at his sleeve. "But where did the dragons go?" she asks, her voice small against the vastness of the night. The old elf hesitates. In Valinor, they might speak of glorious ends of foes vanquished, of evil banished beyond the door of night. Here, by this humble fire, he chooses a different truth. "Not all stories have endings, little one," he murmurs, stirring the embers with a stick. Sparks rise, winking out one by one. Some shadows linger, not as they were, but as possibilities. The children glance at one another, their imaginations already turning his words over like smooth stones from a riverbed. Across the camp, a luthier plucks at a half-strung harp, the notes frayed but sweet. The melody is an old one, older than the ruins they'd passed on their journey east. A tune first hummed in Doriath's halls, now softened by centuries. It threads through the old elf story like silver through cloth, binding past to present. The children sway unconsciously, their eyelids growing heavy, yet they fight sleep fiercely. To dream now would be to miss a single word, a single sigh. They've heard this tale 100 times, but tonight it settles differently. Perhaps because the teller's voice cracks when he speaks of Maglar, last of Fëanor's sons, wandering the shores with his burns and his broken songs. Or because the fire, just for a moment, casts his shadow tall against the trees, and in that silhouette they glimpse not an elder, but a warrior, one who'd stood on those very shores as the world fractured. The night deepens. The youngest child finally succumbs, her head pillowed on her brother's shoulder. The old elf's story winds down like a slowing wheel, his last words barely louder than the rustle of leaves. "Remember," he says, not as a command, but as an offering. The War of Wrath wasn't about endings. It was about, he trails off, his gaze lifting to Eärendil's star, burning cold and constant above them. The children follow his glance, their questions unspoken but alive in the quiet. The luthier's harp falls silent. Somewhere in the forest, an owl cries, a sound like a lost note finding its chord. And so the tale lingers, not with a roar, but with the fragile resonance of a plucked string. The fire shrinks to coals. The children, half dreaming, clutch the edges of the story like cloaks against the chill. Tomorrow they'll beg for it again. Tomorrow they'll ask for dragons. But for now, there's only the starlight, the whisper of the trees, and the unshaped truth that legends aren't stones. They're seeds carried on the wind, taking root where they will.